Michael McCormack is 16 years old on New Year's Day, 1963. He's got a pounding headache, snuck a couple of shandies at last night's party and didn't get enough sleep. But the morning sun is already climbing over Sydney's Lane Cove River and there's money to be made. Golf balls, that's the game. Lost golf balls wash up along the riverbank and teenagers who know where to look can sell them back to the clubhouse for sixpence each. Michael and his mate Dennis Wee-Way have been doing this route for months. They know every bend in the river, every patch of scrub where the good finds hide. They're working their way through the mangroves near Fuller's Bridge when Michael spots something dark in the bushes. It's about 20 metres from the water's edge. Michael, at the time, justifiably suspects it's just someone slipping off a big night. It's not unusual. New Year's Eve brings all sorts to the riverbank. Drunks, lovers, people who couldn't make it home. He's seen it before, so the boys keep walking, keep searching for those lucrative golf balls. The morning's still cool and the river quiet. They find a few wedged in the mud and pocket them. An hour passes. When they circle back around at 8:30, the man is still there. Still in exactly the same position, face down in the dirt. Michael decides to move a little closer this time, close enough to see the man's face properly. It's purple, dark purple, like a bruise spreading across flesh. "That bloke's not sleeping," Dennis says quietly to his mate. They run. Not walking fast, running, scrambling back through the scrub toward the road, toward houses, toward help. When the police arrive, they find something worse than either boy imagined. The man isn't alone. Dr. Gilbert Stanley Bogle lies face down in the scrub, naked from the waist down but still wearing his shoes and socks. Someone has curiously and carefully placed his trousers over his legs, trying to make him at least look dressed, and a piece of carpet lies across his back. His jacket is folded neatly on top, like a blanket, 15 metres away, in a slight depression hidden by the mangroves. They discover the second body. Margaret Chandler, just 28 years old, a mother of two, her party dress bunched around her waist, her entire body covered with torn up cardboard beer boxes. Both show signs of violent vomiting and loss of bowel control. Both have scuff marks on their shoes, dirt under their fingernails. They clearly stumbled around before they died, disoriented, confused, even terrified. And both are dead from causes that, over 60 years later, remain officially unexplained. Welcome to Strewth, a podcast that explores Australia's most perplexing mysteries. And this week, we explore our most baffling New Year's Eve mystery, the case of Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler. I'm your storyteller, Mark, and join me now as we travel back to Bohemian Sydney in the last hours of 1962. The last hours of the lives of Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler. Dr. Gilbert Stanley Bogle was, by all accounts, exceptional. Born in New Zealand in 1924, he'd earned his doctorate at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, working at the prestigious Clarendon Laboratory before joining Australia's Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, the CSIRO, in 1956. By 1962, colleagues described him as the most brilliant member of staff. His expertise was in low-temperature physics and maser technology, critical for radio astronomy. Bell Telephone Laboratories in New Jersey had come calling, and Bogle was just weeks away from departing for America for his dream job. At 38, Bogle was married to Vivian, a school teacher. They had 4 children together, and Vivian was heavily pregnant with their 5th. He was also, according to multiple sources, a charismatic man known for extramarital affairs. Margaret Olive Chandler was born Margaret Murfitt in Western Sydney in 1934. At 28, she was a trained nurse who'd left the profession to become a stay-at-home mother. She had 2 young children, and her husband Jeffrey worked as a scientific photographer at the CSIRO in the same building as Bogle. The Chandlers' marriage was unconventional, even by today's standards. Jeffrey was part of something called the Sydney Push, a libertarian intellectual subculture that rejected conventional morality and practiced what they called free love. He and Margaret had what Jeffrey would later describe as an open marriage. He was openly having an affair with a woman named Pamela Logan. On December 21st, 10 days before the fateful night, CSIRO colleagues Ken and Ruth Nash hosted a Christmas party barbecue at their home in Chatswood on Sydney's North Shore. And it was there that Bogle and Margaret Chandler first met properly. The chemistry was immediate. On the drive home that night, Margaret told her husband she was quite taken with Bogle. Jeffrey's response would later shock conservative Australia. He told her, "If you want to take Gib as a lover, if it would make you happy, then go for it." 10 days later, the Nashes would host another party, New Year's Eve. And this time, neither Bogle nor Margaret Chandler would make it home. The party at the Nash residence on Waratah Street begins around 9:30 in the evening. There was about 20 guests, primarily CSIRO scientists and their partners. The house buzzes with conversation, the clinking of glasses, the anticipation of midnight. Bogle arrives and quickly becomes, as witnesses would later testify, the life of the party. The Chandlers then arrive at around 10 o'clock. Jeffrey is noticeably underdressed compared to the other guests, but nobody says anything. The party rolls on. Music plays, drinks flow, people dance and chat and watch the clock tick toward 1963. At 11:30, Jeffrey announces he's going out for cigarettes. He leaves alone, climbs into his car and drives not to a corner shop, but to Balmain, to attend a Sydney push party at the home of Ken Buckley, a University of Sydney lecturer. There he meets his mistress, Pamela Logan, and together they drive to her lodgings in Darlington. But back at Chatswood, the party continues without him. At around 2:30 in the morning, Jeffrey returns. The party's winding down now, and when he offers to take Margaret home, Bogle volunteers to drive her instead. Jeffrey agrees. He leaves alone, heading home to bed. At approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, Bogle and Margaret Chandler climb into his green Ford Prefect and drive away from the Nash residence. They head toward Lane Cove River Park, a bushland area near Fuller's Bridge. It's a place well known locally, a lover's lane. They park about 70 metres from the bridge and make their way down to a secluded spot near the water's edge. There's a slight depression in the ground surrounded by mangroves, hidden from the road, private. The night is cool and still, and the river laps gently at the banks. But somewhere between 4:45 and 6 o'clock in the morning, both Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler die on that riverbank. When Michael McCormick and Dennis Wee-Way first spotted the body that New Year's morning while hunting golf balls, they thought nothing of it. A drunk sleeping it off seemed perfectly reasonable on January 1st. But when they returned an hour later and found him unmoved, his face now showing that terrible purple discoloration, they knew that something was very wrong. The police response was swift, but what they found at the scene defied explanation. Bogle's body was arranged in a bizarre manner, naked from the waist down, yet still wearing shoes and socks. Someone had carefully placed his trousers over his legs to create the appearance that he was dressed. There was a piece of carpet, later identified as matching material from his car, laying on his back, with his jacket placed neatly on top. Blood had trickled from his right nostril. Margaret Chandler lay 15 metres away in a slight depression. Her party dress was bunched around her waist, her bra pulled down. Her underpants were found some distance away, and Bogle's underwear lay between her legs. Her entire body was covered with broken up cardboard boxes. Both bodies showed the same disturbing signs: violent vomiting, loss of bowel control, slight skin abrasions. Their shoes showed mud and scuff marks, suggesting both had stumbled around before collapsing. A later pathology report, initially suppressed by authorities, would reveal something else: semen on Bogle's body and jacket. They'd been struck down during sexual activity, with no warning. But who or what had struck them down? Because New Year's Day was a public holiday, the forensic examination was delayed 36 hours. When Dr. John Lang, Director of Forensic Medicine, and Dr. William Harold Brighton finally conducted autopsies at Sydney City Morgue on January 2nd, they found themselves confronting what appeared to be a medical impossibility. Both victims showed acute cardiac failure. Both had pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs. Both had clearly died from a lack of oxygen. But two otherwise apparently healthy individuals, aged just 28 and 38, dying simultaneously from natural heart attacks? Highly improbable, almost impossible. Government analyst Ernest Samuel Ogg supervised exhaustive toxicology testing. The laboratory ran every test available to them in 1963. They tested for arsenic, strychnine, morphine derivatives, barbiturates, anything that might show up in the blood or tissue samples. But they found nothing conclusive. The police did their due diligence. They consulted the FBI. They contacted Scotland Yard. They investigated over 1,000 different hypotheses: cone shell poison, funnel web spider venom, aphrodisiacs, even Cold War nerve agents. But nothing matched the evidence. Nothing explained how two people could die so quickly, so violently, with no detectable poison in their systems. The only consistent physical finding was something seemingly minor: purple discoloration in their blood. But in 1963, nobody understood what that meant. The coronial inquest opened on March the 21st, 1963, before Deputy Coroner J.J. Looms. It would resume in May with multiple hearings. Geoffrey Chandler took the stand and testified about his marriage. He spoke openly and honestly about his relationship with Pamela Logan, about his wife's relationship with Bogle. He described his marriage as happy and expressed complete disbelief in any theory of suicide. The party's hosts testified, CSIRO colleagues, police detectives. A Margaret Fowler was called as a witness. She had been Bogle's previous lover for 3 years before their final breakup. But before she could testify, the coroner stood her down, a deliberate move to protect the Bogle and Fowler families from further scandal. The coroner also suppressed evidence about the sexual nature of the death scene, details about how the bodies were found, about the positioning of their clothes, about the semen. These were all withheld from public record. On May the 24th, 1963, Coroner Looms delivered his verdict. Both died from acute circulatory failure. But as to the circumstances under which such circulatory failure was brought about, the evidence, he concluded, did not permit him to say. It was an open verdict. They had died, heart stopping, breathing ceasing, but nobody could explain why. The case exploded across Sydney's newspapers. The Sun and the Daily Mirror launched what historians would later describe as a war between Sydney's two afternoon newspapers, which would go on for months and sell millions of copies. The story, of course, had everything. A brilliant scientist about to leave for America, a beautiful young mother, an open marriage, sexual scandal, unexplained deaths, and a hint of Cold War paranoia. The coverage was relentless, and through it all, one detail nagged at the investigators. Someone had covered the bodies before the teenage boys discovered them. The carpet on Bogle's back, the cardboard boxes over Margaret Chandler. Someone had found them first and tried to preserve their modesty. But who? And why? The leading candidate was a local greyhound trainer who walked his dogs daily on a path that passed the death site. When first questioned, he claimed he'd taken a different route that morning and seen nothing. But his obituary, published in 1977, stated that he had been the first to find the bodies. And years later, a greyhound racing steward would reveal that the man had admitted to covering the bodies for modesty. Fear of being considered a suspect had kept him silent for all of those years. By the time this was confirmed, he was long dead. And then there was also an additional mystery of Margaret Chandler's handbag. In 2006, a woman came forward with an extraordinary claim. As a child, she had found the handbag 4 kilometres away in bushland, near a house belonging to a relative of that very same greyhound trainer. What did that mean? Did the greyhound trainer execute the perfect, undetectable murder of 2 people for the contents of a handbag? Had he removed it from the scene for some other reason? Or was it just pure coincidence and entirely unrelated to the case? Nobody knew. And in the absence of answers, speculation becomes obsession. So throughout 1963 and beyond, the two newspapers continued to wage their circulation war, using the Bogle-Chandler case as ammunition. Every week brings a new theory. Every edition promises revelations. For months they sell millions of copies, each trying to outdo the other with increasingly sensational headlines. And the obsession extends far beyond the newsrooms. In offices across Sydney, colleagues debate over morning tea. Was it the husband? The mistress? Soviet spies? In suburban living rooms, dinner party conversations turn inevitably to the mystery. Everyone has a theory. Everyone knows someone who was at the party, who worked at the CSIRO, who heard something. The case becomes more than a mystery. It becomes a mirror reflecting Australia's anxieties. Sexual scandal in an era of conservative morality. Cold War paranoia just months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Distrust of bohemian intellectuals and their free love philosophies. Fear of what scientists might be doing in secret laboratories. So let's take a look at some of those theories, so you can decide which you think is the most plausible. Let's start with the most obvious theory, the one that seemed self-evident to anyone reading the newspapers in 1963. Geoffrey Chandler, the man whose wife was found dead with her lover on a riverbank, both of them half-dressed, clearly engaged in an affair. The tabloids, of course, loved this angle. Here was, in their eyes at least, a wronged husband who discovered his wife's infidelity and exacted terrible revenge. It fit every convention of the classic murder mystery genre: jealousy, betrayal, poison, the perfect crime. Except for one problem. Geoffrey Chandler had an airtight alibi. He'd been with his mistress Pamela Logan from midnight until well after the deaths occurred. The police browbeat Logan for hours, hoping to break her story, but it held. Multiple witnesses confirmed Geoffrey had been at the Sydney push party in Balmain. The timeline made it impossible for him to have reached Lane Cove River, administered poison, and returned undetected. And more problematically for the jealous husband theory, Geoffrey had actively encouraged his wife's relationship with Bogle. He told her, in his own words, "If you want to take Gib as a lover, if it would make you happy, then you do it." This was not the behaviour of a murderous, jealous husband. But public opinion in conservative 1963 Australia could not accept that. The idea of an open marriage, of a husband who not only tolerated but encouraged his wife's affair, was so foreign to mainstream society that many simply refused to believe Geoffrey was telling the truth. The suspicion followed him for years. In 1969, Geoffrey even published a book titled "So You Think I Did It?", a defiant rebuttal of the murder accusations that had haunted him since that New Year's morning. Geoffrey Chandler was innocent, according to all of the evidence available, and the police knew it, but the public was never accepting of that story. So if not the wronged husband, what about the spurned lover? Margaret Fowler was a scientifically trained librarian at the CSIRO. She'd been Bogle's previous mistress for 3 years before their final breakup. According to police interviews, she had become very steadily obsessed with Bogle. He tried to break off their affair many times before finally succeeding. And now he'd taken up with Margaret Chandler, a younger woman, a woman he'd met just 10 days before his death. The police were, by their own admission, more suspicious of Margaret Fowler than of Geoffrey Chandler. And on paper, she had everything needed for murder: motive, jealousy over Bogle's new relationship, knowledge. As a scientifically trained librarian, she had access to scientific literature about poisons. An opportunity. She'd been at another party that same evening. Agatha Christie would have loved it. But the timeline defeated this theory too. Fowler had left her party at 3:45 in the morning with her husband. The drive to Lane Cove River would have taken at least 30 minutes. She would have needed to locate Bogle and Margaret in the dark, administer poison without being seen, and return home, all within an impossibly tight window. There was no physical evidence ever linking her to the scene. No evidence she'd obtained any poison, and no witnesses placing her anywhere near the river. So Margaret Fowler was cleared as a suspect. But years later, she would make a curious statement that inspired another line of inquiry. She apparently related the deaths in some way to chemical warfare research. She suggested the deaths were connected to secret government research, not a crime of passion. Which brings us to the Cold War conspiracy theories. By early 1963, the world was still reeling from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nuclear war had been narrowly avoided just 3 months earlier, and Soviet spies were thought to be everywhere. Paranoia was the order of the day. And here was Gilbert Bogle, a brilliant physicist working at the CSIRO, about to depart from American research laboratories to work on quantum electronics. What if his death wasn't a crime of passion at all? What if it was espionage? Catherine Dalton, widow of a CSIRO colleague named G.C. Dalton, made never substantiated allegations that Bogle had been assassinated. She claimed he was about to disclose Australian Atomic Energy Commission security leaks and American espionage improprieties in Australia. Even Margaret Fowler and Geoffrey Chandler later gave credence to these claims. The theory gained even more traction when Peter Wright, a former MI5 officer, revealed that Sir Roger Hollis, the Director General of MI5 from 1956 to 1965, had recommended Bogle to the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, or ASIO. Wright spent years trying to prove Hollis was a Soviet mole, the so-called fifth man in the famous Cambridge spy ring. And it was based on this connection Geoffrey Chandler himself speculated that Bogle had been eliminated as a Soviet agent. As you can imagine, the tabloids ran absolutely wild with it. Here was the perfect Cold War story. Soviet operatives assassinating an Australian scientist to prevent his research reaching America, secret agents, untraceable poisons, international conspiracy. But CSIRO officials firmly denied that Bogle's work involved any sensitive international security matters. His research was on low-temperature physics and maser technology for radio astronomy, not weapons. And no evidence ever emerged linking the case to espionage. British, American and Australian intelligence agencies all investigated and found no connection. And the allegations against Roger Hollis himself were later found to be groundless. Christopher Andrews' official MI5 history called the case against Hollis threadbare and a form of paranoia. And so, the espionage theory was, like so many others, built on nothing more than speculation and fear, rather than solid evidence. But the fascination with the case continued, and by the late 1980s a new theory had emerged as the favoured explanation among investigators and true crime enthusiasts: LSD. The reasoning went something like this. Bogle had access to CSIRO laboratories where the hallucinogen could have been produced clandestinely. LSD was still relatively unknown in 1963, and testing for it would have been impossible with the technology available. It fit with the bohemian Sydney push lifestyle, with the party atmosphere, and with the unexplained deaths. For years this seemed like the answer. It explained the lack of detectable poison, it explained the disorientation, the vomiting. It all seemed to fit. And then in 1996, preserved tissue samples were sent to laboratories in America for more sophisticated testing. The first pass suggested possible LSD presence. And for a brief moment, it seemed as this mystery might finally be solved. But when more sensitive retesting was conducted, the results came back definitively negative. No traces of LSD. None. And even if LSD had been present, there are no documented human deaths from an LSD overdose. The theory didn't just fail on the lack of evidence, it failed on basic pharmacology. So, the LSD theory, favoured by many for over a decade, collapsed entirely. By the early 2000s, the Bogle Chandler case had become something of a historical curiosity, the kind of mystery that old detectives talked about in their retirement. The unsolvable case, the one that got away. Everyone directly involved was either dead or very elderly. The physical evidence was long gone. Bogle had been buried in March 1963. Margaret Chandler cremated 2 days later. And even the tissue samples from 1963 had all been used up in the failed LSD testing. The case was officially still open, but nobody expected it to be solved. And then Peter Butt, an Australian documentary filmmaker, started asking questions nobody had thought to ask. Not about poisons, not about suspects, and certainly not about Cold War conspiracies. He started asking questions about the river. He began his investigation in the early 2000s, and instead of focusing on the forensics or the suspects, he went looking for historical records about the Lane Cove River. And what he found was shocking. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, local council officers had received scores of complaints from residents about rotten egg smells emanating from the river. Not occasional smells, constant, severe odours that caused nausea and breathing difficulties. Massive fish kills occurred regularly, hundreds, sometimes thousands of fish floating dead on the surface. A Maritime Services Board study conducted over an entire year found that the bottom muds were saturated to 50 centimetres depth with hydrogen sulfide, H2S, a deadly gas that smells like rotten eggs at low concentrations, but becomes completely undetectable at lethal levels. The source was identified. A flour mill that had been pumping millions of litres of organic waste into the river since the 1890s. Decades of pollution, decades of bacterial decomposition producing hydrogen sulfide gas. And the worst affected location was within a quarter mile of the weir near Fuller's Bridge, exactly where Bogle and Chandler had died. Hydrogen sulfide is heavier than air on a cool, still night, precisely the weather conditions on New Year's morning 1963. The gas would pool in low-lying depressions. It wouldn't disperse, it would concentrate. The hollow where Bogle and Margaret lay, surrounded by mangroves at water level, was a perfect trap. At concentrations above 100 parts per million, H2S instantly paralyses the olfactory nerve. Victims can't smell it. At 200 parts per million, respiratory failure occurs within seconds. And at 1,000 parts per million, a single breath causes instant cardiac arrest. The purple colour discoloration in their blood that pathologists had noted in 1963, it turns out this is a classic sign of hydrogen sulfide poison. But nobody in 1963 had thought to test for it. Nobody had considered environmental poisoning. They were looking for a murder, not an act of industrial pollution. But consulted with toxicologists and pathologists, including some of the same experts who had examined the original evidence. They reviewed his research. They examined the historical records. And one by one they agreed. This was it. This explained everything. The sudden onset, the violent symptoms, the lack of detectable poison in standard tests, the purple discoloration. Bogle and Margaret Chandler, according to this theory, had been killed by hydrogen sulfide gas rising from the polluted river. Peter Butt's documentary Who Killed Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler aired on ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, in 2006. It became the highest rating commissioned documentary in the network's history, drawing over 2 million viewers. The fascination in Australia had continued into the early 2000s. Professor Joe Duflo, Chief Forensic Pathologist at the University of Sydney, endorsed Butt's research publicly. It seemed finally that the mystery was solved. Not murder, not suicide, not espionage or jealousy or LSD, just a tragic convergence of pollution, geography, weather, and really bad timing. Two people who went to a lover's lane on a still, cool night and unknowingly walked into a cloud of invisible poison. But there was a problem. The New South Wales coroner had not formally reopened the case. Despite the compelling evidence, despite expert endorsement, the official verdict remains J.J. Loom's 1963 finding: acute circulatory failure of undetermined cause. Why? Because hydrogen sulfide dissipates rapidly from the body after death. The tissue samples that might have confirmed the theory were used up in 1996 testing for LSD, and both bodies were destroyed in 1963, one buried, one cremated. With a 43-year gap between the deaths and Butt's investigation, conclusive proof is impossible. So even if we accept the hydrogen sulfide theory, and most experts do, some questions remain. If the Lane Cove River was so dangerously polluted for decades, why were Bogle and Chandler the only recorded human fatalities? Fish kills were common, yeah, but no other human deaths or anything near to that were attributed to H2S from the river, despite it being an incredibly popular recreation area. Some critics suggest an alternative explanation, that the purple discoloration and gas could have been generated during decomposition rather than being the cause of death. That what looked like evidence of hydrogen sulfide poisoning was actually just a normal breakdown of human tissue. Others question the timing. If a gas eruption occurred, why did it affect only two people on a popular lover's lane? The theory requires precise timing, the couple arriving when the air was breathable, and then a gas eruption occurring during their rendezvous. Is such perfect, tragic timing plausible? And what about Margaret Chandler's handbag, found 4 kilometres away near the Greyhound trainer's relative's house? Why would he have removed it from the scene if he was just trying to preserve modesty? And what did Margaret Fowler really mean when she mentioned chemical warfare research? These questions may never be answered. The witnesses are gone. The physical evidence is destroyed. The case file gathers dust. Maybe the hydrogen sulfide poisoning theory is very convenient for someone or some group of people. The Bogle-Chandler case offers something rare in true crime, a genuine mystery where the most likely explanation is simultaneously mundane and unprovable. Two people accidentally poisoned by hydrogen sulfide gas erupting from a polluted river during an illicit liaison. No villain, no conspiracy, no murder at all. Just a tragic convergence of industrial pollution, unfortunate geography, specific weather conditions, and terrible timing that claimed 2 lives and confounded investigators for over half a century. The case, officially at least, remains unsolved, and it will almost certainly remain that way forever. The evidence that could definitively prove the hydrogen sulfide theory no longer exists. But Peter Butt's brilliant and dogged research gave us the most satisfying answer we're likely to get. An answer that explains the forensic evidence, the environmental conditions, the eyewitness accounts of river pollution. An answer endorsed by the very toxicologists and pathologists who had been unable to solve it in 1963. So for Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler, that New Year's morning was supposed to be a romantic interlude. Instead, it became their final moments. Minutes spent in confusion and terror as an invisible killer rose from the river around them. Their deaths remain a reminder that sometimes truth is stranger than any fiction, that the deadliest threats can be the ones we can't see, can't smell, can't detect until it's too late, and that some mysteries, no matter how thoroughly investigated, may never move from the category of most likely to definitively proven. Strewth. Thank you for listening to yet another episode of Strewth, where we explore Australia's most perplexing mysteries. The Margaret Chandler case remains officially unsolved. Peter Butt's 2006 documentary Who Killed Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler is available through ABC Archives for those wanting to learn more. He also made a great podcast, which I'll add to the show links. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, share with friends who love true crime, unsolved mysteries. I'm really looking forward to a bumper 2026 here on Strewth. We're going to have new mysteries for you every Wednesday. And next week, we're going to start that by heading to the Highway of Death in North Queensland. If you've got a request for an episode, please feel free to reach out, strewthpodcast@gmail.com, or just find me anywhere on the socials. I'm all about the place. And until then, remember, truth really can be stranger than fiction. Thanks for listening.